I knew I had made a mistake. The second his father stood up from the table, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't slam his hand down. He just stood up, slowly, like his legs didn't quite trust what he had just heard. And the way he looked at me, it wasn't anger, it was something worse. Like I had been sitting in his house this whole time, and he was only just now realizing he had no idea who I was. One word kept echoing in his head, and in mine, Admiral, but that moment didn't happen right away. It came after the smiles, after the polite conversation, after the small comments that didn't sound like insults, but felt like them. Before all of that, I was just a woman standing at their front door, holding a bottle of wine, trying to make a good first impression. I wasn't lying to him. That's the part people always get wrong. I wore the uniform. I showed up to base every morning. I talked about long hours, schedules, supply chains, and the kind of problems that don't make headlines but keep entire fleets moving across thousands of miles of ocean. Everything I said was true. I just never said the whole truth. Because in the Navy, your rank walks into the room before you do. And I was tired of that. I had spent more than 2 decades being saluted before I was spoken to, being listened to before I was understood. Conversations changed the moment people knew. Some got stiff, some got eager, some became careful in a way that didn't feel like respect. It felt like distance, like they were talking to the position, not the person. With Michael, it was different. We met in a small bookstore just outside the base. I was in jeans, holding a paperback, standing in line like anyone else. He asked me what I was reading. I asked him the same. We talked about history, not careers. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into weekends, and somewhere along the way, he decided I worked in the Navy. Not what I did, not who I was, just worked there. And I let him. Not because I was hiding something shameful, but because I wanted something real. I wanted to know what it felt like to be seen without the weight of rank, to be chosen without the influence of authority, to sit across from someone who didn't measure me before they knew me. By the time he proposed, the truth had become complicated. How do you look at someone you love and say, by the way, I'm responsible for operations that affect thousands of sailors across the Pacific? How do you insert that into a life that was built on something simpler? So, I stayed quiet, not out of fear, not out of strategy, but out of curiosity. I wanted to know who would love me, if I was nobody. And when he invited me to meet his parents, I didn't hesitate, because I had a feeling that dinner wasn't just going to introduce me to them. It was going to reveal something much bigger, not about my rank, but about how they saw people like me when they thought I didn't matter. I didn't walk into that house expecting to be impressed, but I also didn't expect to be measured so quickly. The driveway was neat, gravel lined just right, the kind of place where everything had its place and stayed there. A flagpole stood out front, American flag on top, Navy flag beneath it. That caught my attention, not because it was unusual, but because of what it meant. Respect for the idea of service, without really knowing what service looks like. Michael squeezed my hand as we walked up the steps, like he always did when he wanted to reassure me. They're going to like you, he said. I smiled. I wasn't worried about being liked. I was curious about being seen. His mother opened the door with a warm smile and a quick hug, the kind that felt practiced but polite. You must be Emily, she said. We've heard so much about you. His father stood just behind her. Tall, solid, firm handshake. The kind of man who had worked hard his whole life and expected the same from everyone else. So, you're the Navy girl, he said. Yes, sir, I replied. That was the first label. Not my name, not who I was, just a category. Inside, the house smelled like roast chicken and lemon cleaner. Family photos lined the walls, graduations, football games, milestones that had been framed and preserved. It was a good home, a proud home. We sat in the living room for a few minutes. Small talk, weather, the drive, the kind of conversation that fills space without revealing anything. And then it came. So, his father said, leaning back slightly, what do you do in the Navy? There it was. I had answered that question 1,000 times in my career. Briefings, hearings, interviews. But this one felt different. I work in logistics, I said. He nodded once. Paperwork. I smiled. Something like that. And just like that, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Dinner was served right on time. Plates were set down in front of everyone except me. Instead, his mother handed me the serving spoon. "Would you mind helping with these?" she asked sweetly. "Of course," I said, standing up. It wasn't the act itself that stayed with me. It was the assumption behind it. Throughout dinner, the conversation moved around me more than it included me. His father talked about hard work, about how people these days didn't understand what it meant to earn something, about real careers, neighbors' kids who became lawyers, a young man down the street who bought his first house before turning 30, benchmarks, metrics, proof of value. No one asked about mine. His mother leaned in at one point, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel personal. "Do you plan to keep working after you get married?" she asked. I paused for half a second. "I like my work," I said. She nodded politely, but her eyes had already moved on, like the answer didn't quite matter. Michael didn't interrupt. He didn't correct them. He didn't say, "You don't understand." He just stayed quiet, and I understood why. This was the world he grew up in. You don't challenge your parents at the dinner table. You don't disrupt the balance. You let things pass. But sitting there, listening to them talk about ambition and value and what makes a life meaningful, I realized something. This wasn't about me. This was about how they saw people like me. People they believed didn't have much to offer. They weren't cruel. That would have been easier to dismiss. They were polite. And that's what made it clear. Because polite isn't the same as respectful. Polite is surface. It's habit. It's what you give someone when you don't think they matter enough to know more. Respect requires attention. And that night, I hadn't earned theirs. Not because of who I was, but because of who they thought I was. And that realization stayed with me. Right up until the moment everything changed. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. Dinner continued the way polite dinners do, forks against plates, small talk drifting from one safe topic to another, the occasional laugh that filled space more than it expressed anything real. I answered when I was asked. I listened more than I spoke. And I watched. I watched how easily people settle into their assumptions. Halfway through the meal, his father leaned back in his chair and looked at me again. Not casually this time, more directly, like he was trying to figure something out that didn't quite add up. "So," he said, "what's your real position?" I met his eyes. "In the Navy, I mean," he added. There it was. Not curiosity. Not interest. Verification. I could have answered the same way again. Kept it simple. Kept it small. Let the evening end exactly the way it had been going, polite, contained, forgettable. But something in me had shifted. Not anger. Clarity. "I'm responsible for fleet logistics in the Pacific," I said. He frowned slightly, as if translating that into something more familiar. "That's a lot of responsibility for paperwork," he said with a light chuckle. I didn't smile this time. "It's not paperwork," I replied. "It's operations." He waved his hand gently, dismissive without meaning to be. "Sure it is." And in that moment, I knew. Not because of what he said, but because of how easily he said it. I paused just long enough to feel the weight of the room. Then I said it. "My rank is Rear Admiral." The words didn't land loudly. They landed quietly. And that's what made them echo. For a second, nothing moved. A fork stopped halfway to a plate. His mother blinked once, then again, like her mind was trying to catch up with what she had just heard. Michael turned toward me slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to something deeper. His father stared at me. Then he smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, politely. "Very funny," he said. I didn't respond. I reached into my bag, pulled out my military ID, and placed it on the table between us. Not as a challenge, not as a statement, just as truth. He picked it up, looked at it, read it once, then again. You could almost see the moment it registered, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his shoulders shifted, the way his breath changed just enough to notice if you were paying attention. He pulled out his phone, typed something in, scrolled. And then, very slowly, he stood up. No anger, no raised voice. Just that same quiet movement. Like the ground had shifted under him and he wasn't quite sure how to stand on it anymore. The room went still. 10 seconds doesn't sound like much. But when no one speaks, when all you can hear is the hum of a refrigerator and the faint ticking of a clock on the wall, 10 seconds stretches. Michael reached for my hand under the table. "You're serious?" he asked softly. "Yes," I said. His mother looked between us, her expression caught somewhere between embarrassment and disbelief. His father sat back down, slower this time. "Well," he said quietly, "I'll be damned." And just like that, everything changed. Not me. Nothing about me had changed. I was still the same woman who had walked in with a bottle of wine. Still the same person who had answered their questions, passed their plates, smiled at the right moments. But the way they saw me, that changed instantly. His mother stood up and disappeared into the kitchen, only to return with a different set of napkins, the cloth ones. The ones you save for guests who matter. His father reached for my glass when it was half empty. "Let me," he said. The same man who had dismissed my work minutes earlier was now choosing his words carefully, like each one needed approval before it left his mouth. "Ma'am," he added. I shook my head gently. "Emily is fine." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe that. Michael looked at me like he was trying to reconcile two versions of the same person, the one he thought he knew, and the one sitting in front of him now. "So, how many people do you oversee?" he asked. "Several thousand," I said. No one laughed this time. The air had changed. Not into tension, into something heavier. Awkward respect. And as I sat there, watching them adjust, recalibrate, reconsider everything they thought they understood, I realized something that mattered more than the reveal itself. They weren't reacting to who I was. They were reacting to what I represented. And that difference was going to matter a lot more than any rank ever could. And that difference didn't just matter. It changed everything that followed. You could feel it in the room almost immediately. Not tension. Not hostility. Adjustment. The kind that happens when people realize they've misread a situation and now they're trying to correct it in real time without admitting they were wrong. His mother moved first. She returned from the kitchen with a quiet urgency, replacing paper napkins with cloth ones, smoothing them out like details suddenly mattered more. She refilled my water before I had a chance to reach for the glass. When she spoke, her voice softened, slower now, more deliberate. "Would you like anything else, Emily?" Not dear, not casual, careful. His father shifted in his chair, posture straighter than before, like he had just stepped into a different kind of room, one with expectations he understood better. He cleared his throat once before speaking, choosing his words like they carried weight now. "I didn't realize," he said. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I nodded gently. Most people don't, and that was the truth. Michael sat beside me, quieter than I had ever seen him. Not distant, not cold, just processing. Every now and then, he would glance at me like he was trying to align two versions of reality that didn't quite fit together yet. Dinner continued. But it wasn't the same dinner. Every question now sounded like an interview. "How long have you been in? Where were you stationed before this? Do you travel often?" The curiosity was there now. The attention, but it felt different than what I had hoped for, because it came after the reveal. His father called me ma'am again when I stood to clear my plate. I paused. "Please don't," I said quietly. "Emily is fine." He nodded, almost apologetically. But the word lingered in the space between us anyway. That was the part people don't talk about. The shift doesn't feel like respect. It feels like distance, like a line has been drawn where there wasn't one before. His mother leaned forward at one point, hands folded, eyes searching mine with a kind of new awareness. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. It wasn't accusation. It was confusion. I thought about that for a second. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because the real answer wasn't comfortable. Because I wanted to be treated like a person, I said, not a position. Silence followed. Not heavy. Just honest. Michael looked down at his plate. "I didn't know either," he said quietly. I met his eyes. "You never asked," I replied. It wasn't criticism. It was truth. The kind that sits between people and asks them to decide what to do with it. For the rest of the evening, they tried. You could see it in the way his mother listened more closely, in the way his father asked thoughtful questions, in the way both of them adjusted their tone, their posture, even their expressions. They were doing everything right. And yet, something was off. Because nothing about me had changed. Only their perception had. And that's when it settled in the part that stayed with me long after we left that house. They weren't respecting me more. They were responding to my rank. And once you see that, once you feel the difference between being valued and being elevated, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to not knowing. And as I sat there, finishing a dinner that had quietly turned into something else entirely, I realized this wasn't about correcting a misunderstanding. It was about understanding something deeper. Not who they thought I was, but who they were, when they thought I was nobody. And that question didn't leave me when the night ended. It followed me out the front door, into the car, into the quiet space between us as Michael drove us back home under a sky that felt heavier than it should have. Neither of us spoke right away. The road stretched out ahead, familiar and steady, the kind of drive that usually felt easy. But that night, even the silence felt different. Not tense, not broken, just aware. "Are you angry?" Michael finally asked, his hands still fixed on the steering wheel. I shook my head. "No," I said. "I'm not angry." He glanced at me, waiting. "I'm clear." That was the closest word I had for it, because what I had seen that night wasn't confusing. It wasn't complicated. It was simple, in a way that made it harder to ignore. "They didn't know," he said quietly, almost like he was defending something he wasn't sure how to defend. "I know," I replied. "That changes things," he added. I turned slightly toward him. "No," I said gently. "It doesn't." He frowned, just a little. "It changes how they see you." I nodded once. That's exactly the problem. He didn't respond right away, and I didn't rush to fill the silence. Because this wasn't something that needed to be argued. It needed to be understood. "They didn't underestimate me," I said after a moment. "They treated me exactly the way they thought was appropriate." The words settled between us. Not sharp, not loud, just undeniable. Michael exhaled slowly. "That's a harsh way to look at it." "It's an honest way to look at it," I replied. We drove another mile in silence. Streetlights passed in steady intervals, each one briefly lighting the inside of the car before fading again. It reminded me of something I had learned a long time ago. Clarity doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in moments. Flashes. Enough to see, but not enough to ignore. "Polite isn't the same as respectful," I said. He glanced at me again. "I thought they were being respectful," he said. "They were being careful," I replied. "There's a difference." He tightened his grip on the wheel slightly, thinking, "They didn't mean anything by it." "I know," I said again. And I did. That was the part that made it harder, not easier, because it wasn't cruelty. It was assumption. The kind that doesn't raise its voice. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that sits quietly in the way people decide who is worth their time, their curiosity, their attention. By the time we reached the apartment, I already knew something had shifted. Not between me and his parents, between me and the idea I had been holding on to, the idea that if I just removed the title, the rank, the uniform, I could step into a space where I was simply seen as a person. That idea felt different now, incomplete, because the truth was, removing power doesn't reveal neutrality. It reveals preference. It reveals who people choose to notice, and who they don't. Later that night, after Michael had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, and I thought about something I had seen over and over again throughout my career. Power doesn't change people. It reveals them. I had always believed that in a professional sense. In command. In leadership. In moments where decisions carried real consequences. But that night, I saw it somewhere else. At a dinner table. In the way a serving spoon was handed to me. In the questions that weren't asked. In the silence that filled the space where interest should have been. And I realized something that stayed with me long after the evening ended. The most honest version of a person isn't who they are when they're impressed. It's who they are when they're indifferent. When they think you have nothing to offer. When they believe your story isn't worth hearing. That's the version you can trust. That's the version that tells you everything you need to know. And once you see it, you don't forget it. You carry it with you, into every room, every conversation, every relationship that comes after. Because at some point, the question stops being, who am I to them? And becomes something much harder to answer. Who are they? When I'm nobody. And once that question takes root, it doesn't just stay about them. It turns inward. It starts asking something harder. About the person sitting right next to you. Michael didn't become a different man overnight. That would have been easier to understand. He was still kind, still steady in the small ways that had mattered to me from the beginning. He still brought coffee the way I liked it, black, no sugar. Still reached for my hand without thinking when we crossed a street. Still remembered things most people forget. But something had shifted. Not in what he did. In what he felt. I could see it in the pauses. The way he hesitated before speaking, like he was measuring his words against something new. The way his eyes lingered on me a second longer than before, not with curiosity, but with calculation. Not judgment. Comparison. A few nights after the dinner, we were sitting on the couch, the TV on, but neither of us really watching. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound drifting in from the street outside. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "So why me?" he asked. The question hung there. Simple on the surface, but it carried more weight than he realized. I turned toward him. "What do you mean?" He exhaled slowly. "I mean, you're responsible for thousands of people. You make decisions that affect operations across, thousands of miles?" He shook his head slightly. "And I'm a project manager. I sit in meetings. I track timelines. I don't even come close to that." There it was. Not insecurity. Not exactly. A shift in how he saw himself. Next to me. "I never asked what you make," I said quietly. "That's not the point," he replied. "It is," I said. "It's exactly the point." He looked at me, confused. I leaned back slightly, choosing my words carefully. "I didn't choose you because of what you do," I said. "I chose you because of how you treated me when you thought I was ordinary." He looked down at his hands. "But I didn't know who you really were," he said. I met his eyes. "You did," I replied. "You just didn't know my title." He didn't answer right away. And that silence said more than anything else could have. Because I could see it now. He was trying to reconcile two things that didn't fit comfortably together in his mind. The woman he fell in love with, and the woman the world would now measure differently. "I don't know how to compete with that," he said finally. I shook my head gently. "You're not supposed to. But everyone else." "I'm not everyone else," I said, a little more firmly than before. He stopped. "I don't need you to be more," I continued. "I need you to be present." He looked at me, searching for something. "And I need you to stand beside me," I added softly. "Not behind them." That landed, not like a confrontation, like recognition, because that was the part that mattered most. Not what his parents thought, not how the world measured success, but what he chose to do in the moment when it mattered. That night at the dinner table, he hadn't said anything. He hadn't corrected them. He hadn't questioned the assumptions. He had stayed where it was comfortable. And comfort is a choice. "I didn't realize I was doing that," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. "And I did." That was the hardest part. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He just hadn't learned to see it. And now he had to decide what to do with that. We sat there for a long time after that. No raised voices. No dramatic conclusions. Just two people facing something real. Because love, at this stage in life, isn't about excitement or chemistry. It's about alignment. About whether two people can stand in the same space without one of them shrinking. And as I looked at him that night, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit before. This wasn't a test of my rank. It was a test of us. Of whether what we had built could exist without comparison, without hierarchy, without the quiet pressure of who the world thought we were supposed to be. And for the first time since that dinner, I didn't know the answer. And not knowing is a difficult place to stay, especially when you're used to certainty. In my world, decisions get made with incomplete information all the time, but once they're made, you stand by them. You don't hesitate. You don't drift. You move forward. This felt different. Because this wasn't about logistics or timelines or outcomes measured in miles or hours. This was about identity. About how two people see themselves, and each other, when the balance shifts. The next few days were quiet. Not in a cold way. In a careful way. Michael still showed up, still asked about my day, still made dinner plans and followed through. But there was a new layer beneath everything. Something unspoken, but present. He was thinking. So was I. One evening, I came home later than usual. A supply delay had turned into a 3-hour call, coordinating reroutes across multiple time zones. When I walked in, Michael was sitting on the couch, laptop closed, just waiting. "You really do carry a lot," he said. It wasn't admiration. It was realization. "I always have," I replied. He nodded slowly. "I think that's what I didn't understand," he said. "Not just what you do, but what it means." I set my bag down and sat across from him. "And what does it mean to you now?" I asked. He hesitated. "That I don't know where I fit in it." There it was. Not jealousy. Not resentment. Displacement. I studied him for a moment. "You don't need to fit into my world," I said. "You need to stand in your own." He looked at me, uncertain. "That sounds good," he said. "But it doesn't feel that simple." "It's not," I replied. And I meant that, because the truth was, I was facing my own version of the same question. Not about where I fit, but about what I needed. For years, I had controlled how people saw me by controlling what they knew. It was a form of protection. If they didn't know my rank, they couldn't treat me differently because of it. But now I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. You can't control how people measure you. You can only decide what you accept. "I need to ask you something," Michael said, breaking the silence. I nodded. "Would you still have chosen me if I had been less?" he asked. "And less." The word sat between us, undefined but heavy. "Less what?" I asked. "Less successful. Less enough." I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know, but because I understood what he was really asking. If the roles were reversed, if he were the one sitting at that dinner table being quietly dismissed, would I have stayed? "I chose you because of how you treated me," I said finally. "Not because of what you achieved." He held my gaze. "And now?" I didn't look away. "Now I'm watching," I said gently. He let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "That sounds like a test." "It's not," I replied. "It's awareness." That distinction mattered, because I wasn't trying to judge him. I was trying to understand if we could exist in the same space without one of us adjusting to fit the other. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I think I've spent my whole life measuring myself," he said. "Against other people, against expectations, against whatever came next." I nodded. "Most people do." He looked at me. "And you?" "I stopped a long time ago," I said, "because there's always going to be someone with more rank, more money, more recognition. If that's how you measure yourself, you'll never arrive." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know how to unlearn that," he said. I believed him. Because unlearning something that's been built into you over decades isn't quick. It's not clean. It's uncomfortable. "I don't need you to have it figured out," I said. "I just need you to be willing to see it." He nodded slowly. And in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't about fixing each other. It was about whether we were willing to grow, without losing ourselves in the process. Because real conflict isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the space between what you've always believed and what you're starting to question. And we were both standing right in the middle of it, trying to decide which parts of ourselves we were willing to let go. And growth isn't always easy to recognize from the outside. Sometimes it looks like effort. Sometimes it looks like performance. And sometimes it looks like change, even when the foundation underneath hasn't moved at all. That's what it felt like the next time I saw his parents. They invited us to lunch a few days later. A small diner about 10 miles from their house, the kind with vinyl booths, a faded menu board, and coffee that's been refilled so many times it tastes stronger than it should. We arrived early. They were already there. His mother stood the moment she saw me, her smile wider than before, her posture straighter, like she had rehearsed this version of the greeting. "Emily," she said warmly, "please sit here." She gestured to the best seat in the booth, the one facing the window. Not next to it. Not across. The best one. His father nodded as I sat down. "Good to see you," he said, his tone measured, respectful, careful. Everything about them felt intentional. The waitress came over, pad in hand. "What can I get you, hun?" she asked. Before I could answer, his mother spoke. "She'll have whatever she wants." I smiled slightly. "Coffee is fine," I said. The waitress nodded and walked away. Michael sat quietly beside me, watching. Not the conversation, the details. He was starting to see it too. The way tone shifts before words do. The way people adjust their behavior when they believe something about you has changed even when you haven't. His father leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. "I've been reading about naval logistics," he said. "Didn't realize how complex it was." I nodded. "It can be." He smiled, a little too quickly. "You must handle a lot of pressure." "Yes," I said, "but so do a lot of people." That answer seemed to pause him. Not because it was unexpected, but because it didn't elevate what he thought it should. His mother asked about my family. "My parents must be very proud," she said. "They are," I replied. "But they didn't raise me to be proud of a title." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't quite know what to do with that. Because in her world, titles meant something. They organized people. They explained them. And without them, things became less clear. At one point, his father looked at me directly. "I hope you didn't think we were disrespectful the other night," he said. I held his gaze. "I don't think you were trying to be," I replied. He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I took a breath. "I think you treated me the way you treat people you don't expect much from." The table went quiet. Michael shifted beside me. His mother looked down at her coffee. "That's not fair," his father said. "We were polite." "Yes," I said calmly. "You were." He waited, and I let the silence sit for a moment before finishing. Polite isn't the same as respectful. That landed, not like an accusation, like a realization he hadn't reached yet. After lunch, Michael and I stepped outside while his parents stayed to pay. The air was cool, the kind of afternoon that felt calm on the surface. "I didn't see it before," Michael said quietly. "Most people don't," I replied. He looked back through the window at his parents. "They're trying." "I know," I said. And I meant it. They were trying. They were adjusting their behavior, choosing their words more carefully, offering more attention, more interest, more consideration. But effort and understanding aren't the same thing. Because what I saw wasn't a change in how they valued people. It was a change in how they valued me. And that distinction matters, more than most people realize. Because real change doesn't just alter how you treat one person, it changes how you see everyone. And as I stood there, watching them through the glass, I understood something clearly. They weren't there yet. Not fully. Not honestly. And until they were, everything else would just be adjustment, not transformation. And once you see the difference between adjustment and transformation, you start paying attention in a different way. Not just to what people say, but to what they do when they think it doesn't matter. That's what stayed with me in the weeks that followed. Not the dinner. Not the reveal. Not even the way the room shifted. It was the pattern. The quiet, consistent pattern of how people decide who is worth their time. I started noticing it everywhere. At the base, in meetings, in passing conversations. Who people listened to first, who they interrupted, who they overlooked. It wasn't always intentional. Most of the time, it wasn't. But it was real, and it followed the same rule I had seen at that table. We say we value character, but we respond to status. We say everyone deserves respect, but we offer it selectively. Not because we're bad people, because we're conditioned. Conditioned to measure before we understand. Conditioned to rank before we relate. And once you recognize that, you can't ignore it. You start asking a different kind of question. Not who is this person, but who do I think this person is, and why? That question matters more than most people realize, because it reveals something uncomfortable. We don't just judge based on what we see, we judge based on what we expect. And expectation is a quiet filter. It decides who we listen to, who we learn from, who we dismiss before they even speak. I thought back to that night, the serving spoon, the polite smiles, the conversations that moved around me instead of through me. Nothing about that moment was loud, but everything about it was honest. Because when people believe you have nothing to offer, they don't invest in you. Not their time, not their curiosity, not their respect. And that's the part that stays invisible until it happens to you. I don't blame them for it. Not entirely. Because I've seen it in places far bigger than a dining room. I've seen it in boardrooms, in command centers, in decisions that affect thousands of lives across thousands of miles. The scale changes. The pattern doesn't. And that's the lesson that settled in for me. Not as a judgment, as a standard. The real measure of a person isn't how they treat someone impressive. It's how they treat someone they think can do nothing for them. No title, no leverage, no benefit, just a person. Because someday, whether we expect it or not, we all sit in that seat. We all become the person no one is trying to impress. And in that moment, what we give others is exactly who we are. And once you understand that, you stop looking for perfect endings. Because real change doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up quietly. In small choices. In uncomfortable conversations. in the willingness to sit with something long enough to let it reshape you. Michael and I didn't fix everything overnight. We didn't walk away from that week with clarity or certainty or some clean, satisfying resolution. What we had was honesty. And that was harder. We slowed down. Not because we were pulling apart, but because we were learning how to stand next to each other without comparison getting in the way. Some days felt easy, familiar, like nothing had changed. Other days felt heavier, like we were both aware of something we couldn't unsee. But we stayed, not out of habit, out of choice. His parents changed too. Not dramatically, not completely, but enough to notice. The conversations became more balanced. The questions felt more genuine. Not perfect, but more real than before. And over time, that mattered more than any apology they could have offered. Because growth, when it's real, doesn't announce itself. It shows up in consistency. Months later, when we finally set a new date for the wedding, it wasn't about timing. It was about alignment. No uniforms, no titles, just names. Just two people choosing each other without needing anything else to justify it. And looking back now, I don't see that night as a mistake. I see it as a moment that revealed everything we needed to know. Not about rank, not about status, but about who we are when those things are taken away. And in the end, that's what stayed. Not perfection, not pride, just the quiet understanding that love, real love, doesn't stand above or below. It stands beside. This story reminds us that titles may change how people respond to us, but they should never determine how we value one another. Real character shows up in ordinary moments at the dinner table, in quiet assumptions, in whether we offer respect before we see status. It also teaches that love cannot survive on admiration alone. It must be built on equality, honesty, and the willingness to stand beside each other without comparison. In everyday life, the lesson is simple. Pay close attention to how people treat those who seem to have nothing to offer. That is often the clearest measure of who they truly are.